I have identified 10 key areas of being a DM that can be improved by reading fantasy books. Well, I've actually identified 11, but 10 just sounds better, so I'm going to give you 10 and then a bonus one at the end. And then I have challenged myself to give you one book recommendation for each of these sections, which is actually quite hard to do because there are so many amazing fantasy books out there. And the first area that is really important for a Dungeon Master is character work. While your players just have to focus on playing the one character while you're playing your campaign, you as a DM have to play everyone else in the world, which sometimes can be hundreds of characters. And it can be really hard to not just create City Guard number 4, probably also called Barry, and probably also doesn't have much of a character. But sometimes these are the biggest mistakes that Dungeon Masters make, and here is a book recommendation to help you get better ideas for your characters. And the book I'm going to recommend is The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. Out of every fantasy book I have read so far, this definitely has the best character work for me. And something that is very impressive in this book is it's not just the main characters that are interesting, it is pretty much every single character that they come across in their journey as well. Each of them feel unique and they don't feel like a carbon cutout or just your stereotypical type of character. But I do have to warn you, this book does have dark themes. It is called grim dark fantasy, and that essentially means there are dark themes and sometimes things don't look great for characters who are involved in the story. Just don't expect there to be a fairy tale ending or anything like that. The second area that can definitely be improved by reading fantasy is world building. I know this is a bit more specific for people who are creating their own worlds, and maybe if you're playing in a already made world, this is a little bit less necessary, but I still think it's good to get your world building knowledge up so that if your players do go in a direction you don't expect, you can come up with something on the fly that is just as interesting. And I'm going to make a bit of a risky suggestion here because the book that I have read that has definitely got the best world building in it is quite a difficult book to get into. A lot of people struggle with it because of the way the author tells the story and because of how rich the world is, but I think that is actually just a more of a reason to read it if you're trying to improve on your world building elements. And that book is The Garden of the Moon by Stephen Erickson. This is book 1 in the Malazan series, and it really does go deep into the lore of the world, and there's some amazing ideas in there. And just in this one book, it explores so many different avenues of this world, from the deity system to the politics to the different environments of the world, which is why it's a great book to read if you want to improve your world building. But I understand that it is quite difficult, so if you are a beginner reader, I'm going to suggest The Fellowship of the Rings, the first book in the Lord of the Rings series instead. Right, so next up is a also very important thing for a Dungeon Master to get good at, and that is pacing. This one's a bit more of a difficult one to suggest a book for because the pacing in one person's game might be quite different to a different game. Some people like to play role-playing games quite slow-paced and very descriptive and not moving the plot overly quickly, whereas others are just action. But the book I'm going to recommend is Mistborn, or The Final Empire, as it's called in some places, by Brandon Sanderson. Now this book is actually really good for Dungeon Masters for other reasons as well. The world is really unique, some of the creatures and the races are really unique, and you're not going to find them in any other books. But when we're talking about pacing, this story at its core is a heist that turns into a rebellion, and with that the author really successfully brings it up to a fast-paced point when it needs to be, but also slows it right down for like the planning sequences, for example. So it's a really good book if you need to learn a bit more about pacing in your game. So next up is Conflict and Stakes. I'm sure there are some players out there that enjoy low conflict and low stake kind of games, but I think I'm pretty safe in saying that most people will want quite high conflict and quite a lot of stakes so that the decisions they make while they're playing the games actually have some impact. So with that in mind, I'm going to suggest The Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. Now I'll be very shocked if you've never heard of this and you know nothing about it, but the story itself has so much conflict and lots of stakes, and the story goes up and down throughout. So there's just lots and lots to learn from it. I'm not going to dwell too much on it because you probably already have heard of it or watched the TV show. So let's jump into the next one, which is Combat Descriptions. I've played in quite a lot of different D&D games with different dungeon masters, and one of the things that stands out the most is the combat. I'm sure everyone who has ever played before has been in a game where the combat's a little bit slow and it's just roll die, see if you hit, yes you hit, move to the next person. But then you might have also played in games where the descriptions are really deep and there's lots of stakes and the combat's really exciting and everyone has to work together and get on board to get through it. Well, I want to recommend a book which is going to really help you with your descriptions of the combat, and that's The Rage of Dragons by Evan Winters. So from my understanding, Evan Winters is really into his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as well, and you can really tell by the descriptions of how the combat flows. And I think this can be helpful for Dungeon Masters because a lot of people just describe the single action that is happening, so the barbarian swings their axe and grazes someone, for example, without connecting it to what happened before and what the other people in this combat are doing. So by reading this book, you'll get a really good example of how combat should flow between the different people involved and back and forth with the two people that might be fighting. Now let's go on to the description of atmosphere. And once again, this is one where it really depends on your game. You could have a whimsical fantasy type game, or you could have a darker gritty game, and they're two very different fantasy book recommendations. But the book I'm going to recommend is The Painted Man, or it's called The Warded Man, over in the US by Peter Brett. In this world, demons come out at night and humanity have learned how to create wards around properties and around cities to keep them out. And just with that small little description there, you can probably think about how descriptive it is at night with these demons coming out of the ground, trying to attack these wards, and maybe sometimes people get stuck outside of the wards and they have to run or fight. But something else you'll learn from reading this book is the descriptions of the actual settlements themselves. Sometimes they're in little hamlets in the middle of nowhere, and you really have to get that across as an author for the risk of the demons to make sense. So he does a great job of describing them, but as well as the big cities, and it goes into a desert type of area at one point as well. So there's quite a few different descriptions that go on throughout the book, which is why I thought this might be one of the better recommendations out of everything I could recommend, because there's loads of different types of descriptions that he does really well. Next up, we're going to talk about foreshadowing and payoff. Some of the best campaign experiences I've had have been where a foreshadowing has been done without the players knowing, and then there's a payoff at a point and everyone loses their mind as they've worked it all out. And this happens time and time again in fantasy books, but the one I'm going to recommend to you is Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. This is one of those books where clues are just put in the book throughout the entire story, and then it is revealed at the end, and you can look back and go, that's because of that and that and that. And it's just a really good fantasy story with a really interesting magic system as well. This one's really easy to pick up and read as well, so it could just be a general recommendation for any DM that wants help with pretty much anything. Next up, I'm going to recommend a book about group dynamics. So obviously in any tabletop role-playing game you probably have a group of people that are always going to be together more or less, unless they split at the party, and they're going to be going through some kind of quest or some kind of adventure. Now being able to manage this and make it exciting is important, so I'm going to recommend to you Kings of the Wild. This book follows a group of retired adventurers as they have to do one last quest. But now they're a little bit beaten up, some are injured, some are overweight, and there's quite a lot of comedy in this as well as the actual quest. This book will really help you see what a dynamic of a group can be like, and then you can try and interject that into your players to make them feel it as well. Now we're going to talk about villains, and this is a very hard one to give a recommendation for because there are so many different types of villains, but the recommendation I'm going to go for is Homeland by R.A. Salvador. And this is a bit of a bonus recommendation because it's actually based in the Forgotten Realms, which is the world that D&D is often based in. This follows a drow called Drist who lives in the Underdark in a civilization that at its core is evil. And there are lots of characters that are shown throughout this story that could be main villains. There's your powerful magic user that is looking over everything and pulling the strings. There's your brute that just wants to get the way that they want by force. There's charismatic manipulators that come in, manipulate the situation and get out with what they want. So there's loads of good examples of villains, and this is a really easy read. It's quite short as well, and especially if you're playing D&D, and maybe even if you're playing in the Forgotten Realms itself, this is a great book to read to understand a bit more about the Underdark. Next up, I'm going to recommend a book to you about cultural nuance. This might only be helpful if you're looking to run a game that is going to different cultures across a whole continent or a whole world, and maybe not so much if you're just running a campaign that stays in like this one woodlands and does this one quest line. But if you are looking to run a campaign that goes to loads of different cultures, the book I'm going to recommend to you is The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. Now this is a pretty big book, I will warn you at the beginning, but it does go through loads of different types of cultures, and they will give you an insight into how you can describe and write them in a good and sensitive way. This is part of a larger series called the Stormlight Archives, and if you are going to read all of the 5 books that are in that, you're going to get an even deeper example of how to do cultures right. This is a world that is ravaged by a storm every few days, and as such, travel between cultures is difficult, and therefore the cultures in one place is very different to one that might be still pretty close. So this story does a great job at having very distinct places with their own cultures all over the map. And the final area that I think is important for a Dungeon Master to understand is exploration and discovery. This does once again depend on the campaign that you're running, but exploration and discovery can be a really vital part of a D&D campaign. So the book that I'm going to recommend is A Shadow of Gods by John Gwynne. This is a Norse-inspired story, so if that is something you're interested in, this will be a great read for you as well. But they go and investigate ruins and discover, I obviously don't want to spoil anything, but they discover things, and the description around that by the author is really good. And I have no doubt it's going to give you some inspiration as to what you can put in your campaign. So there you go, there are 11 recommendations for you, but I want you to put your recommendations down in the comments as well, so other people who watch this video can go down there and see other people's opinions on these 11 sections. And if you want other content about fantasy books and D&D, please make sure to subscribe to see more from me.